I gotta be honest, I miss the old Windows 98 gaming days with the old school beige PC, keyboard, mouse, large CRT, and of course, a cool set of speakers. The late 90s on the PC represented some classic PC games, some of the best ever, and it was a few years ago where I made a video converting my old Xbox Series S into a Windows 98 retro gaming PC, all thanks to developer mode and DOSBox Pure. The experience was pretty good overall, but it still missed that retro vibe. Not to mention, it didn't work with my old keyboard and mouse. The truth is, I've wanted an old Windows 98 gaming PC for years, but they're not really that cheap anymore, and because they're getting seriously old, getting one up and running and maintaining an old PC can be a real pain. And this is where this bad boy comes in. This motherboard is something that I've dreamed about for years. A modern x86 Windows 98 motherboard in a tiny form factor that provides a modern DOS and Windows experience without the headache of old hardware. And this is exactly what the ITX-Llama is, an ITX board that uses a Vortex X86 system on a module processor that's been designed to play pretty much anything from old school games like Wing Commander all the way up to early games that supported 3D acceleration. The ITX-Llama is built specifically for old DOS and Windows 98 gaming with all the features you could ask for, all in a small form factor and a compatible x86 chip, which means native code, no emulation. The motherboard itself is quite small and comes packed full of features. The Vortex X86 base system on a module can be clocked from anywhere from 100 MHz all the way up to 500 MHz. On the BIOS, caches can be disabled, which means that you can dial in the ITX-Llama to suit the games that you want to play. Want to play Wing Commander? Just disable caches and drop down the CPU clocks. Or if you want to play 3D accelerated Windows 98 games at 640 by 480, set the CPU to 300 MHz or higher and enable those caches. The Llama also comes standard with 128 MB of RAM on board, more than enough for the era. And if you look at the back of the board, there's an interesting set of connectors, including two USB 2.0 ports, old school PS2 connectors for mouse and keyboard, and one game port. There's also a set of connectors for line in as well as outputting to a set of speakers. The ITX-Llama not only supports analog audio ports but also digital optical audio out with a built-in Crystal CS4237B sound card, which is compatible with AdLib, Sound Blaster Pro 2 and WSS. It also supports external OPL3 modules, wavetable boards and a 40-pin connector for a Raspberry Pi for the MT32Pi firmware integration. For storage options, there are two. There's a built-in micro SD slot as well as a SATA connector. Now, when it comes to which one should be used, it's recommended that if you want to run Windows 98, a dedicated SATA drive should be used. But if you're just running DOS games, the SD card will work just fine. Now, my system here is running a cheap old 200GB SSD running Windows 98 that I've had for years. And we'll talk about some of the limitations of running an SSD on Windows 98 later in the episode. For power, a standard ATX power supply connector is supplied, and it's even possible to connect up a low power Pico power supply. This device doesn't really require much power draw. Now, on average, the ITX-Llama is said to perform around the speed of a Pentium 233 MHz MMX, but with the addition of 3D acceleration via the AGP slot, it can play many early 3D accelerated games at good speeds. And that's where we need to talk about the AGP slot. This is a 3.3 volt keyed AGP slot which runs at 66 MHz, which means it's 1 times speed and compatible with most 3.3 and universal AGP cards. So if you have an old 3D Effects Voodoo 3 laying around, which is what I'm using here, it will work just fine. Other cards, such as a Radeon 9250, I'm also told will work. So this device is for the enthusiast who may want to relive the old DOS and Windows days. Now for me, I use this device mainly for gameplay captures from real hardware where it's very difficult to do so without old school dedicated hardware. Now the ITX-Llama is available to buy at $299 US. I picked mine up from retrodreams.ca, but keep in mind that this is very much a niche thing. Like much of the retro community, you'll need to either get in on a pre-order or get in on the waiting list. Now, according to the website, the pre-order batch 2 has just sold out, which means that there's probably going to be another pre-order batch coming up. So I would recommend you either keep an eye on the website or maybe follow Retro Dreams on Twitter to keep updated on when the next batch of pre-orders will become available. Certainly not ideal, but we have to keep in mind that we're talking about a niche product. But let's move on. Now, the goal I had in mind was to put together a complete Windows 98 retro gaming build with the ITX-Llama. This was something that I tried to do with my Xbox Series S, but I quickly realized it was not going to work. But now, with the supplied connectors and the AGP slot, it's possible to connect up my old CRT as well as my old school PS2 Mouse and Keyboard. Now for this, I'm using a fractal design TerraJade mini ITX case. This allows me to mount the ITX motherboard, install a power supply, and my SSD all inside the case. But to be very clear, this case is not a straight plug-and-play solution. Installing the graphics card required some modification. And this is a bit of a warning to anyone that's looking to mount their ITX-Llama into a standard mini ITX case. You're probably going to find that there's not going to be any configuration out there that allows you to do it out of the box, outside of any specific custom 3D printed ones, which is specifically designed for the motherboard. So I wanted to give a quick note here for anyone that is interested in trying to mount your ITX-Llama in a ITX mini case. And one of the things you're going to find is that you're going to have a lot of trouble mounting the AGP card. In this case, we have the 3DFX Voodoo 3. And what you'll find is there's not really that many ITX configurations, or mini ITX configurations, I should say, out there that allow you to mount the ITX-Llama in a case without any type of modification. And you can see that this particular case here, I have to have the back off of the case for all the access that I need, right? So the other thing that I want to talk about has to do with AGP extenders and cables. If you are looking to mount your ITX-Llama in a ITX or mini ITX case, then you're going to probably end up having to use some type of AGP adapter. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that depending on the type of adapter that you buy, your system will simply not boot up. And what I mean by that is if we take a look at the cable on the left-hand side here, this is an AGP extender. And you can see it's probably about 6 or 7 inches in length. And unfortunately, this is never going to work on the ITX-Llama simply because this particular cable is way too long and there is no shielding. Something that is more appropriate would be something like this. Now with this particular cable, you can see it's shielded to about 1.5 inches in length, and this cable actually works fine, or this adapter works just fine. And it has the added feature of allowing you to kind of bend it and kind of move the AGP card in the specific position that you need. Now I ended up just using a kind of a right angle adapter and mounting my card kind of upside down, and it sits pretty nicely in the back of the case. It is a little bit fiddly because it's still not mounted to anything, so when I plug in the VGA cable, I have to be very careful that I don't just take the card out of the AGP slot, but otherwise it works just fine. But I just want to make this very well known to anyone that's interested in a ITX-Llama build with a power supply inside of the case. And that's something that I wanted to do, where basically the entire setup was just in one case. I didn't have any components like sticking out, or there's no add-on power supply that I have to worry about. Everything is just inside the case itself, and it just works. So how do you install Windows 98 on an ITX-Llama that doesn't have a disk drive? Well, thanks to the onboard SD card slot, it's as easy as installing a FAT32 formatted card with the Windows setup files on it. But what about partitioning and installing Windows 98 on an SSD? Well, it definitely comes with some challenges. The first is the capacity size of formatting FAT32. Microsoft only allows up to 32GB partitions, but a very popular tool on Windows called FAT32 Format is a free program that allows you to configure any hard drive or SD card higher than 32GB. For this, I formatted my SSD as a 64GB partition on this 200GB SSD. Now the reason for this, first of all, is that I don't think I'll ever require the entire 200GB. Even 64GB is overkill. And second, and more importantly, I wanted to leave space available at the end of the drive for trim. Now trim is an important feature of SSDs that's been around since Windows 7, and it kind of works like this. When you delete a file, the operating system sends a trim command to the SSD that marks the blocks as free for reuse. This helps with performance degradation by avoiding unnecessary write operations. It also helps with the garbage collection process, which consolidates free space. Without trim on the operating system, an SSD can degrade faster than any regular mechanical drive. On an old operating system like Windows 98, there is no built-in support for trim, so my workaround was to just use a smaller partition than the drive itself to mitigate any potential degradation to that partition itself. I should also mention I'm not an expert on SSDs and trim, and this is just information that I've read. There may actually be Windows 98 compatible trim tools out there, so don't take this information as fact, but I've been using a 200GB SSD with a 64GB FAT32 partition since the beginning of January, with heavy use of installing, uninstalling and playing games, and I've not experienced any degradation, errors or any weirdness with my SSD to date. Once you've sorted out your partition, installing Windows is as normal. However, there are drivers on the ITX-Llama GitHub page you'll need to install for the Ethernet, USB, Crystal Audio and the onboard chipset. Next, of course, is your graphics card drivers. I'm using a 3DFX Voodoo 3 and I'm using the custom ones from philscomputerlab.com. Not only a very handy website for all your old DOS and Windows gaming needs with lots of drivers, his YouTube channel is a wealth of information about DOS and Windows on modern hardware, and I'll leave a link to both of those in the description below. Now the last thing, of course, is to install some games, and this is where we ran into a bit of a roadblock. You see, most Windows 98 games come on CD, and many of them out there require no CD cracks, which of course you can find, but sometimes it's not the easiest thing in the world for a specific game. So to work around this, we use an app known as Daemon Tools. This installs nicely on a Windows 98 device, and it allows you to effectively set up a virtual CD-ROM drive that you can mount ISOs and install games that way. It's even capable of working around DRM protection measures such as Secure ROM and Safe Disk. Now with everything set up, my old VGA monitor, PS2 Mouse and Keyboard, and even my old Sony desktop speakers, this setup is all but completed. The retro gaming PC build I've always wanted is here. The performance of the ITX-Llama is great, and it does everything it's set out to do. I ran a selection of games, most of them from between 1995 to 1999, and they all ran quite well. No crashing or any issues. Performance, of course, will vary on the game that you're playing. Unreal came out in 1998, and it runs better than the system I used to own back in the day, but don't expect silky smooth 60 FPS, especially on a 3DFX Voodoo 3. It's a blast to play some old PC ports of games that I never even knew existed on the PC. For example, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Other games such as Wipeout, Excel and Formula 1 were early 3DFX titles by Psygnosis, and they all run very fast. RTS games like Total Annihilation and Command & Conquer Red Alert look and run superb on this display at even high resolutions. It's all about reliving the games of the PC of the era. Need for Speed 2 is another game that I really love, and it's as smooth as butter on this thing. Of course, even with a Windows 98 build, I can drop back to DOS and play games there just fine. But as always, things aren't perfect. One real bummer is that the Crystal sound chip still isn't right with some games. I'm not sure if this is a driver issue, a software issue, something needs to be updated, but the biggest disappointment for me was when I eagerly booted up Second Reality, the legendary demo released by Future Crew. While it runs fine, the sound is completely busted. Hopefully this can be addressed in an updated patch or firmware. But in conclusion, if you're looking to rebuild an old retro Windows gaming PC, then the ITX-Llama might be the right option for you. Unless you've already invested time and money in an old retro PC, this is a superb choice. It's small, low power, and I simply love it. The Mr. FPGA core for x86 still needs work, and emulating old DOS games using DOSBox, while it does run pretty well, has its many challenges. Real games on real hardware is what you really want on PC, and there's already large community support for this device, and I'm very excited to see future updates to the hardware. And as always, I'll leave links to everything in the description below. This video is not sponsored, everything was paid for out of pocket, and I'm just a massive fan of devices like this. But for now, we're going to leave it here for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.